The moment the wig touched the floor, the entire restaurant forgot how to breathe. Nobody expected the evening to begin that way. The dining room of Kane's Steakhouse was known for discretion. Wealthy guests came for privacy. Politicians came for quiet conversations. Athletes came to avoid cameras. And when Victor Kane entered the building, people lowered their voices without being asked. The restaurant was one of the most exclusive places in Chicago, and on most nights, the biggest drama involved reservation lists and expensive wine. Tonight would be different. Danielle Carter moved between tables carrying a tray of sparkling water glasses. 29 years old. Black. Professional. Calm. The kind of waitress guests rarely noticed until they needed something. Her uniform was immaculate. Her posture straight. A dark wig framed her face neatly beneath the restaurant's warm lighting. She smiled at customers, refilled drinks, helped new staff members when they struggled. To most people, she looked like an ordinary employee finishing another shift. Nobody knew the story she carried. Nobody knew why the wig mattered. Near the center of the restaurant stood Linda Mercer, the floor manager. 43 years old. Impeccably dressed. Sharp voice. Sharper opinions. She prided herself on controlling every detail inside her restaurant. Employees feared disappointing her. Guests respected her efficiency. Linda confused fear with authority so often that she no longer knew the difference. Across the room, Victor Kane sat in a private section surrounded by several business associates. His reputation entered restaurants before he did. Conversations softened when he appeared. Staff members became more careful. Even experienced executives seemed eager to stay on his good side. Yet Victor himself remained unusually quiet. He listened more than he spoke, observed more than he reacted. Tonight, his attention rested on a business discussion taking place over dinner. At least at first, Danielle approached a nearby table carrying a dessert order. A young server accidentally brushed against her shoulder while rushing past. One plate shifted slightly. Nothing fell. Nothing broke. A minor mistake. The kind that happens every night in every busy restaurant across America. Danielle immediately steadied the tray. Problem solved. Most people would have forgotten the moment instantly. Linda Mercer did not. Unbelievable, she snapped loudly. Several guests looked up. Danielle stopped walking. I am sorry. Linda stepped closer. You are always making excuses. Danielle blinked. The accusation made no sense. Yet she remained calm. Experience had taught her that arguing rarely improved situations like this. Nearby diners exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few looked away. Others pretended not to listen while hearing every word. Linda crossed her arms. Maybe if you spent less time hiding behind that wig, you would pay attention. The room grew quieter. Danielle's expression changed slightly. Not anger. Not fear. Something deeper. A warning. Yet Linda either missed it or ignored it. Linda, Danielle said softly. Please. The single word should have ended the conversation. It did not. Linda reached forward. Several employees froze. One server gasped. Danielle stepped backward instinctively. Too late. In one sudden movement, the wig came free. Silence. Absolute silence. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Glasses hovered in midair. Even the music from the restaurant speakers seemed distant. Danielle stood motionless beneath the warm dining room lights. No wig. No explanation. No defense. Just stillness. Across the restaurant, Victor Kane slowly looked up from his table. And for the first time all evening, every person in the room was staring at the same thing. The silence lasted only a few seconds. It felt much longer. Danielle Carter stood motionless in the center of the dining room while the wig rested on the polished floor beside her shoes. Around her, wealthy guests stared in shock. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked angry. A few simply looked confused. Nobody seemed prepared for what had just happened. The confidence that had fueled Linda Mercer moments earlier began fading beneath the weight of dozens of watching eyes. Yet she still refused to recognize the line she had crossed. Now everyone can see the truth, she said. Her voice sounded louder than before because the restaurant had become so quiet. Danielle lowered her eyes briefly. Not from shame. From exhaustion. There are moments when a person realizes that explaining themselves would require more energy than they possess. This was one of those moments. Near the back of the dining room, a server quietly covered her mouth. Another employee looked ready to cry. They knew pieces of Danielle's story. Not all of it. Just enough to understand why the wig mattered. The guests did not. To them, the scene remained a mystery. Across the restaurant, Victor Kane slowly set down his glass. The movement was small, almost invisible, yet several people at his table noticed immediately. Powerful men often reveal their emotions through tiny actions because they rarely need larger ones. Victor's expression remained calm. That was what made it unsettling. Linda glanced around as though expecting support. She found none. The laughter she imagined never arrived. No one joined her. No one smiled. Instead, an uncomfortable tension spread through the room. A donor near the window stood up and quietly walked toward another table. An elderly couple exchanged disappointed looks. A young businessman shook his head. Public humiliation often reveals more about the person causing it than the person enduring it. Danielle bent down slowly and picked up the wig. Her hands remained steady. That detail surprised everyone watching. Most people expected tears, anger, a confrontation. Danielle offered none of those things. She simply held the wig against her chest. The restraint made the scene even more powerful. Linda crossed her arms. Maybe now people will stop making excuses for you. Several employees stared at her in disbelief. One hostess looked toward the floor. Another waiter stepped forward before stopping himself. Nobody knew what to do. Then Victor Kane rose from his chair. Conversations did not stop. They had already stopped minutes ago. Yet somehow the room became even quieter. People noticed when Victor stood. They noticed because he rarely did anything without purpose. His chair slid softly across the floor. The sound echoed through the restaurant. Danielle looked up. So did Linda. Victor walked toward them with measured steps. No hurry, no drama, just certainty. The guests watched every movement. Linda attempted a nervous smile. Mr. Kane, I assure you this is an internal personnel issue. Victor did not answer immediately. His eyes moved from Linda to Danielle, then to the wig in Danielle's hands. For several seconds, he simply observed. The way a judge studies evidence before speaking. The way a person searches for truth instead of appearances. Danielle wished the floor would open beneath her. Not because of Victor, because she wanted the night to end. Yet something about his expression stopped her from looking away. He was not staring at what Linda exposed. He was staring at what Linda failed to see. And for the first time since the wig touched the floor, Danielle had the feeling that someone in the room was finally asking the right question. Victor Kane's gaze remained fixed on Danielle Carter. The restaurant waited. Wealthy guests sat motionless beneath warm amber lighting. Employees stood frozen beside tables. Even Linda Mercer seemed uncertain for the first time that evening. She had expected embarrassment. She had expected humiliation. She had expected the room to focus on what Danielle lacked. Instead, the room seemed increasingly interested in what Danielle possessed. Victor finally spoke. His voice was calm enough to make people listen more carefully. What question were you trying to answer? Nobody understood what he meant. Linda frowned. Excuse me. Victor looked toward her briefly. You pulled off her wig. His eyes returned to Danielle. Why? The simplicity of the question unsettled the room. Because it exposed the truth hiding beneath the incident. Linda had not solved the problem. She had not enforced a policy. She had not protected the restaurant. She had simply wanted to make someone feel smaller. The silence deepened. Linda crossed her arms defensively. I was proving a point. Victor nodded once. Which point? Several guests lowered their eyes. The conversation was no longer about Danielle. It was becoming about character. Linda searched for an answer. None arrived. Across the restaurant, an elderly woman seated near the window quietly shook her head. A businessman at another table removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. The atmosphere felt heavier with every passing second. Danielle remained standing where she was. The wig still rested against her chest. She wished the attention would disappear. Yet she also sensed something changing. For the first time all evening, people were no longer staring at her appearance. They were staring at the behavior that exposed it. Victor glanced around the dining room. Interesting. His voice remained measured. A room full of adults watched someone be humiliated. Nobody moved. Nobody argued. The observation landed hard because it was true. People had witnessed the moment. Few had intervened. Many had simply frozen. Fear of discomfort often disguises itself as neutrality. Victor understood that better than most. Linda attempted another defense. She works here. I have a right to manage my employees. Victor looked at her. Management and humiliation are not the same thing. Several guests nodded quietly. The words spread through the room like a ripple across still water. Danielle, noticed one of the younger servers standing near the kitchen entrance. Tears glistened in the girl's eyes. The sight affected her more than anything Linda had done. Because humiliation never belongs to one person. It teaches fear to everyone watching. Victor turned back toward Danielle. Would you like to go home? The question surprised her. What? You have had a difficult evening. His expression remained calm. Would you like to leave? Danielle considered the offer. Every part of her wanted to disappear from the restaurant. Yet another part resisted. She had worked hard for this job. She had done nothing wrong. Leaving felt too much like surrender. She straightened her shoulders slightly. No. The answer emerged stronger than she expected. Victor nodded. Good. For the first time, a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not because he enjoyed the situation, because he recognized resilience when he saw it. Around the restaurant, something shifted. Guests who had spent the last several minutes feeling uncomfortable began seeing Danielle differently. Not as a victim, as a woman refusing to let someone else define her worth. And without realizing it, Linda Mercer had already lost the only thing she thought she controlled: the respect of the room. Respect is a fragile thing. It takes years to earn and seconds to lose. Linda Mercer was learning that lesson in real time. The restaurant remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence people create when they are reconsidering someone. Earlier in the evening, Linda had been the authority figure, the manager, the person employees feared and customers trusted. Now every glance directed toward her carried a question. How could she have thought this was acceptable? Danielle Carter felt the shift too. She still held the wig carefully against her chest. Her scalp reflected the warm restaurant lighting, exposing a truth she had spent years protecting from public discussion. Not because she was ashamed, because she wanted to be known for who she was rather than what she had endured. Across the room, guests were beginning to understand that difference. Victor Kane remained standing. His presence filled the dining room without effort. Some people command attention by speaking loudly. Victor never needed to. One look from him often accomplished more than an argument. Linda attempted to regain control. This has become ridiculous, she said. Everyone is acting as though I committed some terrible crime. Nobody answered. The lack of support was louder than criticism. A server near the bar quietly shook his head. An older woman seated near the window folded her hands together and stared at Linda with open disappointment. Victor finally spoke. You are still focused on yourself. Linda looked stunned. What does that mean? Victor glanced toward Danielle. You expose someone. Then back toward Linda. And your first concern is how people are judging you. The words landed hard. Around the restaurant, several guests nodded. Danielle wished the conversation would end. Every additional minute felt like standing beneath a spotlight she never asked for. Yet she also knew something important was happening. People were finally paying attention to the right thing. Not her appearance. Their behavior. A young hostess approached cautiously carrying a folded restaurant jacket. Without saying a word, she offered it to Danielle. The gesture was small, kind, human. Danielle accepted it with a grateful smile and draped it gently across her shoulders. The hostess returned to work, but her action changed the atmosphere more than any speech could have. Compassion often arrives quietly. Victor noticed. So did everyone else. Linda crossed her arms again. Defensive. Cornered. Nobody knows the whole story. The statement hung in the air. For a brief moment, several people wondered if she was about to reveal some justification. Instead, she fell silent. Because there was none. Across the dining room, an elderly customer slowly rose from his seat. He had been a regular at the restaurant for years. Staff members knew him by name. He looked toward Danielle. Young lady, he said gently. I hope you know this says far more about us than it does about you. Danielle blinked. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. Thank you, she replied softly. The man nodded and sat back down. The exchange lasted only seconds. Yet it changed something. The room was no longer united by shock. It was becoming united by empathy. Victor looked around the restaurant and seemed satisfied by what he saw. Not because the situation had happened, because people were finally responding to it honestly. Then his attention returned to Danielle. For the first time all evening, he asked a question no one else had bothered to ask. Are you okay? The restaurant fell quiet once again, because hidden beneath all the embarrassment, all the judgment, and all the drama was the simplest question of all. And somehow, it had taken the longest for anyone to ask it. The question lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Are you okay? It was such a simple sentence. Yet it seemed to reach Danielle Carter in a way everything else had not. The apologies people considered offering, the explanations, the judgments. None of them mattered as much as that question, because it acknowledged something everyone else had forgotten. She was a person before she was a spectacle. Danielle adjusted the restaurant jacket around her shoulders and took a slow breath. The dining room remained quiet. Guests waited. Employees waited. Even Linda Mercer remained silent. For once, nobody was trying to control the conversation. "I will be," Danielle said softly. Victor Kane nodded. He did not press further. That alone surprised her. Most people asked questions because they wanted details. Victor seemed interested only in the answer. Across the room, the tension continued, shifting into something else. Understanding. Not complete understanding. Most people still knew nothing about Danielle's life. Yet they were beginning to recognize the limits of their assumptions. An elderly woman near the window dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. A businessman who had spent the first part of the evening focused entirely on a merger discussion now looked deeply uncomfortable with himself. Public humiliation has a strange way of exposing everyone in the room, not only the person targeted. Victor returned to his table but did not resume his meal. The food sat untouched. His business associates remained unusually quiet. Finally, one of them spoke. "You knew something was wrong immediately." Victor glanced toward Danielle. "No." The man looked confused. Victor folded his hands. "I knew someone was being treated as though they mattered less than everyone else." The answer settled heavily over the table. Nearby, several guests overheard it. The restaurant seemed full of people re-examining moments they once ignored. Danielle moved toward the service station carrying empty glasses. She needed something familiar, something normal. Work had always provided structure when emotions became difficult. Yet before she reached the station, a young hostess stepped beside her. The same hostess who had given her the jacket. "Can I tell you something?" Danielle smiled. "Of course." The hostess hesitated. "My sister wears a wig too." Danielle stopped. The young woman looked nervous. "She always worries people will judge her." Danielle felt a lump rise in her throat. "A lot of people do." The hostess nodded sadly. "But she keeps going anyway." For the first time all evening, Danielle laughed. A genuine laugh. Small, warm, human. "Then your sister is stronger than she thinks." The hostess smiled and returned to work. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet it reminded Danielle of something important. The story was never really about hair, or appearance, or even embarrassment. It was about dignity. Across the dining room, Linda Mercer remained standing alone. The isolation around her had become impossible to ignore. Employees avoided eye contact. Guests no longer sought her attention. The authority she valued so much had evaporated. Not because someone took it from her, because she had misused it. Victor watched quietly. He understood power better than most people ever would. Real power is not demonstrated by humiliating someone weaker. It is demonstrated by protecting their dignity when nobody else bothers. Around the restaurant, conversations slowly resumed. Glasses clinked again. Orders were delivered. The evening moved forward. Yet nothing felt exactly the same, because the room had witnessed something uncomfortable. And sometimes uncomfortable truths become the lessons people remember longest. The restaurant gradually returned to motion, but it did not return to normal. People continued eating. Servers continued working. Conversations resumed. Yet every interaction carried the memory of what had happened. Some nights passed through a room without leaving a mark. This was not one of those nights. Danielle Carter felt it every time a guest looked at her differently. Not with pity, with respect. The distinction mattered. She never wanted sympathy. Sympathy often reduced people to their struggles. Respect recognized who they were despite them. Near the service station, she finally slipped the wig back into place. The movement was quiet and practical. No announcement. No explanation. Just a woman reclaiming a small piece of privacy. Several employees noticed. None commented. The silence felt kind. Across the dining room, Victor Kane remained seated with his business associates, but the conversation had changed. Earlier they discussed investments and contracts. Now the topic seemed almost irrelevant. One executive glanced toward Danielle and shook his head. "I still do not understand how she stayed so calm." Victor looked up from his untouched coffee. "Maybe she has had practice." The answer lingered. Because everyone knew he was right. Calmness rarely appears by accident. It is usually earned. A few minutes later, One of the younger servers approached Danielle. He had worked at the restaurant for less than 6 months. Can I ask you something? Danielle smiled. Sure. The young man hesitated. How did you not lose your temper? Danielle considered the question carefully. Then she looked around the restaurant. Because anger would have changed the story. The server frowned. What do you mean? Danielle adjusted a stack of menus. If I became angry, people would remember the argument. She glanced toward the dining room. This way they remember the behavior. The young man stood quietly for a moment before nodding. He understood. Across the restaurant, Linda Mercer remained isolated. No formal punishment had been announced. None was necessary yet. The consequences had already begun. Trust disappears quickly when people reveal who they are under pressure. Employees who once feared her now questioned her. Guests who once respected her professionalism now remembered her cruelty. She sat alone at a corner table reviewing paperwork she was no longer reading. Every few minutes her eyes drifted toward Danielle. Regret had finally arrived. Unfortunately, regret rarely arrives in time to prevent damage. Victor noticed that too. He understood something many people never learn. Mistakes happen. Character is revealed by how people respond afterward. Near the end of the evening, the restaurant owner arrived after hearing fragments of what occurred. Several staff members quietly explained the situation. The owner's expression grew increasingly serious. He thanked them and walked toward Danielle. The room subtly watched. Danielle braced herself. The owner stopped in front of her. Are you all right? It was the second time someone had asked that question tonight. Somehow it still mattered. Danielle nodded. I will be. The owner looked around the dining room before speaking again. You handled yourself with remarkable professionalism. Danielle thanked him softly. The conversation remained brief. Yet it confirmed something important. The narrative had completely changed. Earlier, people saw a waitress losing her wig. Now they saw a woman keeping her dignity. As the evening continued winding down, Victor found himself watching Danielle one last time. Not because of what happened to her, because of how she responded. Power impresses people. Wealth impresses people. Success impresses people. But grace under humiliation is far rarer. And deep down, everyone in the restaurant knew they had witnessed it. The restaurant owner remained true to his word. He spoke privately with staff members. He reviewed security footage. He listened to witnesses. Most importantly, he paid attention to details rather than rumors. By the following hour, nearly everyone working at Cane's Steakhouse understood that the evening would have consequences. Not because someone lost a wig, because someone had forgotten how to treat another human being. Danielle Carter continued working despite every reason to leave. Guests noticed that too. The dining room had transformed from a place of luxury into something closer to a classroom. People were learning lessons they never expected to encounter over dinner. Near the back of the restaurant, two women discussed the incident quietly. One shook her head. I cannot imagine staying after something like that. The other watched Danielle refill water glasses at a nearby table. Maybe that is why she is stronger than most of us. Across the room, Victor Kane heard the comment. He found himself agreeing. Strength is often misunderstood. People imagine strength as dominance, aggression, power. Yet tonight he had witnessed a different version. A woman humiliated in front of strangers who still chose dignity over revenge. That required more strength than most people possessed. The evening continued winding down. Dessert plates disappeared. Coffee cups emptied. Several guests approached Danielle before leaving. Some offered kind words. Others simply thanked her for the professionalism she displayed under impossible circumstances. Danielle accepted every gesture politely. Yet she remained careful not to let the attention change her. Attention can be addictive. She had seen it happen before. Near the service station, the young hostess who had spoken with her earlier returned. This time she carried something small. A folded photograph. My sister wanted me to show you this. Danielle looked down. The photograph showed a smiling young woman wearing a colorful scarf. She starts college next month, the hostess said proudly. There were times she thought she never would. Danielle smiled warmly. Tell her I said congratulations. The hostess nodded. She wanted me to tell you something too. Danielle waited. She said seeing someone stand tall tonight would have helped her a lot a few years ago. For a moment, Danielle struggled to respond. Not because she was emotional, because she suddenly understood that the room had been watching more carefully than she realized. People do not only remember what happens to someone, they remember how that person responds. Across the dining room, Victor stood to leave. Several business associates followed his lead. The moment he rose, conversations subtly shifted. The owner noticed. So did the staff. Victor walked toward the exit before stopping unexpectedly beside Danielle. She looked up from the tray she was carrying. "Mr. Kane." Victor nodded. "I wanted to tell you something before I leave." Nearby guests immediately became interested. Danielle felt another wave of unwanted attention approaching. Victor seemed aware of it. "Not here." He gestured toward a quieter corner of the restaurant near the entrance. Danielle followed. The noise of the dining room softened behind them. For several seconds, Victor simply looked at her, not evaluating, not judging, thinking. Finally he spoke. "People believe respect comes from fear." Danielle listened. "Tonight reminded me that respect and fear are not the same thing." The words lingered between them. Victor glanced back toward the restaurant. "Nobody in this room fears you." Then he looked directly at her. "And yet everyone respects you." Danielle stood quietly beneath the warm entrance lights. Because deep down, she understood something important. Respect earned through character lasts longer than respect demanded through authority. And before the night was over, the entire restaurant would understand it too. The words stayed with Danielle Carter long after Victor Kane walked away. Respect and fear are not the same thing. The sentence seemed simple. Yet the more she thought about it, the more truth she found inside it. For years, people had mistaken strength for intimidation, authority for dignity. Tonight the restaurant had witnessed the difference. Near the entrance, Victor paused before leaving. Several guests stopped him to say goodbye. Others shook his hand. Yet even while speaking with them, his attention occasionally drifted back toward Danielle. Not because he felt sorry for her, because he admired something he rarely encountered. Character under pressure. The dining room had grown quieter as the evening approached closing time. Empty tables outnumbered occupied ones. Candles burned lower. The staff moved more slowly now that the dinner rush had passed. For the first time since the incident, Danielle felt the tension beginning to leave her shoulders. The night was finally ending. Yet before it could end completely, one final chapter remained. Near the service station, the restaurant owner stepped forward and gathered several managers for a private conversation. Employees noticed immediately. News travels quickly in restaurants, faster than in most workplaces. Nobody heard every word, but everyone understood the topic. Linda Mercer stood among the managers listening quietly. The confidence that once defined her posture had disappeared. Not because someone embarrassed her, because reality had caught up with her. A few moments later, the managers dispersed. Linda remained standing alone. Several employees looked away. Others continued working. Nobody celebrated. Nobody smiled. Accountability is not entertainment. It is simply necessary. Danielle watched from a distance without satisfaction. Revenge had never interested her. She did not want Linda humiliated. She wanted people treated better. There is a difference. Across the room, Victor noticed that too. One of his associates nodded toward Linda. You could say this ended badly for her. Victor considered the comment. Then he shook his head. No. The associate looked confused. Victor glanced toward Danielle. It ended badly when she stopped seeing another person as human. The answer silenced the table. Because everyone knew he was right. Consequences were merely the final chapter. The real mistake happened much earlier. Near closing time, Linda finally approached Danielle. The restaurant seemed to notice all at once. Conversations faded. Employees paused. Even guests preparing to leave slowed their steps. Nobody knew what would happen. Danielle looked up as Linda stopped in front of her. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. The silence felt familiar now. Then Linda looked down. Not dramatically, not performatively, just honestly. I was wrong. The words came quietly. Danielle studied her. The apology was imperfect, awkward, human, which made it more believable than a speech ever could have been. I know, Danielle replied softly. Linda nodded. Her eyes briefly filled with emotion before she looked away. I am sorry. Danielle stood quietly. Then she offered the same grace she had offered everyone else that night. I hope you learned from it. Linda nodded once more and walked away. No applause followed. No dramatic reaction. Real change rarely arrives with music and speeches. Sometimes it arrives with 4 simple words. I was wrong. Across the dining room, Victor Kane watched the exchange carefully. A faint smile appeared. Because justice had finally arrived. Not through power. Not through fear. Through accountability. And as the final guests stepped into the Chicago night, the restaurant felt lighter than it had all evening. The humiliation that began the night no longer defined the story. Respect did. By the time the last customer left Kane's Steakhouse, the city outside had settled into the deep quiet of late night. Traffic lights reflected against rain-dark pavement. Street lamps cast long shadows across nearly empty sidewalks. Inside the restaurant, staff members finished closing duties beneath dimmed lighting. Chairs were stacked. Tables were cleared. The evening was finally over. Yet nobody seemed ready to forget it. Danielle Carter stood near the service station gathering her belongings. Her uniform jacket rested over one arm. The wig remained neatly in place. For the first time all night, she felt alone with her thoughts. Exhaustion had replaced adrenaline. Silence had replaced tension. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt reflective. Some days change a person's life because something extraordinary happens to them. Other days change a person's life because they discover who they are under pressure. Tonight had been that kind of night. Across the restaurant, several employees prepared to leave. The young hostess who had spoken with Danielle earlier waved goodbye. A dishwasher thanked her for helping train him months ago. A server offered a warm smile before heading toward the exit. Small gestures. Ordinary gestures. Yet they meant more to Danielle than any speech could have, because they reminded her of something important. The people who truly knew her had never measured her by appearance. Near the front entrance, Victor Kane remained speaking quietly with the restaurant owner. Most people expected powerful men to leave first. Victor had stayed until the end. Eventually, the owner thanked him for his patience and disappeared into the office. Victor turned and noticed Danielle preparing to leave. For a moment, he simply watched. Then he walked toward her. The nearly empty restaurant felt different without customers. More honest somehow. There was nobody left to impress. No audience. No expectations. Just two people standing at the end of a very long night. Danielle smiled politely. Still here? Victor laughed softly. Apparently. The answer surprised both of them. For a few seconds, they stood in comfortable silence. Then Victor looked around the restaurant. People will talk about tonight for a long time. Danielle sighed. That is exactly what I was afraid of. Victor nodded. He understood. Most people spend their lives chasing attention. Danielle spent the evening trying to escape it. For what it is worth, he said, they are talking about the wrong thing. Danielle raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Victor looked directly at her. They think tonight was about a wig. The words hung in the air. It was not. Danielle listened. Victor continued. It was about dignity. Neither spoke for a moment afterward. Because there was nothing to add. The statement was true. The evening had never been about hair, or appearance, or embarrassment. It had been about how people choose to treat one another. It had been about compassion, respect, humanity, the things money cannot purchase and power cannot guarantee. Victor reached for the door and held it open. Cool night air drifted into the restaurant. Danielle stepped toward the exit and paused. The city lights stretched beyond the glass like distant stars. Thank you, she said quietly. Victor shook his head. No. A faint smile appeared. Thank you. Danielle smiled back. Then she stepped outside and disappeared into the Chicago night. Victor watched her go for a moment before turning back toward the empty restaurant. Earlier that evening, people laughed at what they thought she had lost. By the end of the night, they understood what she never lost at all. Her dignity. And long after everyone forgot the menu, the wine, and the conversations, that was the part they would remember.